Welcome to today's program, and we have probably the most prolific Christian writer in the world. I've written over 40 books, and I'm not even in the same league as Jerry Jenkins. So, Jerry, thank you so much for being on the program.
Great to be with you, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Now, Jerry, I don't know how you do it. Do you ever sleep?
Well, you know, I do sleep, but I don't sing or dance or preach. You know, I mean, I have only one gift, and I feel obligated to exercise it. So maybe if I was a little more eclectic, I wouldn't write so many books. My kids say I've written more books than I've ever read.
Well, you know, just start at the beginning. You're from the Chicago area. You've been deeply involved with Moody Bible Institute and Moody Monthly. Tell us a little bit about your early days and how you got involved in writing.
Yeah, I was the son of a police chief in Elk Grove Village, Illinois, and I am one of four sons that he had, and of course most cops have their kids follow their footsteps and go into police work, and my two older brothers did that, so I'm sort of the black sheep of the family. But my dad always encouraged me to do what I felt I should do and what I felt called to, and he was an outstanding believer, and so as my mother was, so they encouraged this. But I got hurt playing sports in high school, and to stay close to the sports scene, I started sports writing for the school paper, and almost immediately realized I had found my niche. I was probably 14 years old, and I started stringing for a local paper, and because I wasn't even old enough to drive yet, my parents had to drive me to the ball games and then drive me to the newspaper office. But I got paid $1 an inch for whatever appeared in the newspaper, so I consider myself a professional writer since age about 14.
Oh, that's great. So eventually you've been sort of working as a stringer or as a local correspondent there. How come that you finished up at Moody and you've been so involved with them over these years?
Well, I was always impressed by Moody. You know, living in the suburbs and being aware of Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, I always visit friends there, and I was always impressed with the sort of singular focus of the place. I mean, they really, Bible is their middle name, and they really believe in the efficacy of Christ, and they've got one purpose, and that's to teach the Word and reach the world. And so I wanted to go there. I went as a student just 1 year to get a good Bible background, and then by the time I was 19, I was sports editor of one of those papers that I'd been stringing for, but I always wanted to get back to Moody somehow. And in 1974, I went back as editor of Moody magazine, and worked there over 30 years. I was editor of the magazine, then director of publishing, and finally vice president for publishing. And then in 1990, decided to go full-time freelance. My book writing had sort of taken on a life of its own, and I stayed associated with Moody as their writer in residence, even though it was my residence. But then years later, I was asked to join the board of trustees, and so it's been a privilege to really have spent virtually my entire adult life somehow connected with Moody.
Now, for those people who maybe don't know who D.L. Moody was, you know, being raised in Britain, of course, he was a legend over there, coming over and preaching. But give us a little thumbnail sketch of Mr. Moody.
Yeah, he was a 19th century guy, and he lived I think he only lived to be in his early 60s maybe, and but he was the Billy Graham of his day. He was the evangelist that everybody knew about. In fact, he was as well known in the United States as the president back in those days. When he died in, I think it was 1899, headlines across the country just said Moody is dead, and everybody knew who they were talking about. And so, yeah, he was quite a dynamic force of nature. Not fully educated and didn't always use the best grammar, but so passionate about his faith that he would just he preached in huge crusades all over the United States and in Great Britain and a lot of other places in Europe, and just had an incredible impact, and his impact is still felt today. I mean, the fact that Moody Bible Institute is more than 125 years old and still maintaining that singular focus that he started it with is amazing.
How on earth did he preach to these large crowds without microphone or amplifying?
That is amazing. I know in some places there are little sketches that he might have used a megaphone at times, but usually you don't see that. And he was quite a heavy guy. I think he wasn't very tall, but he was very heavy. But he had a huge chest and apparently a huge diaphragm.
Yeah.
And basically just did this with the ability to speak correctly using not just his throat but his whole body, and really people never complain about not being able to hear him.
Jerry, if you could ever meet him, what would be the number one question you'd like to ask him?
I'm most fascinated by by two experiences he had. One was when his Sunday school teacher kept pursuing him and visited him in a shoe store one day where Mr. Moody was a shoe salesman, and led him to Christ. I'd love to hear that story. And then there's a great story later too where a man says to Moody, "The world has yet to see what God can do through a man who's wholly committed to Him." And Mr. Moody reportedly said, "By the grace of God, I'll be that man." And from then on, his ministry was just blessed. I mean, just no matter where he was and how he ministered, thousands came to Christ.
That's wonderful. Well, we're speaking with Jerry Jenkins, and back in May of 2004, you were on the cover of Newsweek with Tim LaHaye, and the two of you were called the New Prophets of Revelation. Now, many people listening to this have read the Left Behind books, have seen the movies. How on earth did that begin?
Well, it was really Dr. LaHaye's idea. I had known of Dr. LaHaye back in the early 90s. A magazine I worked for, we published his column, but I'd never met him. And I signed with a new agent, Rick Christian, in Colorado Springs, and he called me one day and he asked me if I'd ever met Tim, and I said no, but of course I know who he is. He was a best-selling author of many nonfiction books. And he said, "Well, Tim is a nonfiction writer with a great fiction idea, and you're a fiction writer with no ideas." So he said,
"That's pretty rude.
Let's get you two together." And so I remember we met at a hotel room in near O'Hare Airport, and Tim shared with me this story he had. He said he'd written books since before I was born. He's about the age my parents were before they died. Mm-hmm. He had been writing books about prophecy longer than I'd been alive, and he said they were all nonfiction. They sold fairly well, but he said everywhere I go, I see people reading fiction, reading novels on airplanes. And he said he was on an airplane and he saw a pilot flirting with a flight attendant, and he just started thinking about this. And he thought, what if the pilot had a wife at home who was a believer? And while this guy's flirting with the flight attendant, the rapture happens, and a bunch of people on this plane disappear. And he realizes that his wife's going to be gone when he gets home. That was all he had. That was the germ of the story. And the thing that I appreciate so much, I respected him as my elder, and of course as a theologian and scholar, which I'm not. I was raised in that tradition and believed the same way he does about end times things, but I really appreciated the fact that he wasn't going to try to help write this book or these books, because it's hard to co-write fiction, especially from the standpoint of somebody who's a nonfiction writer. But he was a great cheerleader and a great resource, and I just was able to take that first scene and kind of run with it. And we had no idea it would become the phenomenon it did. It became the biggest crossover series ever. And it used to be that Christian publishers sort of tried to sneak up on the secular market. And here we've got a Christian minister and a Christian author writing about the rapture of the church and the return of Jesus Christ, and just telling it flat out, and it becomes a New York Times bestseller, and they don't even count books sold in Christian bookstores. So it really was quite an amazing thing.
So to talk me through, I'm a writer myself, but I find fiction very, very difficult. Let's say you're starting on that first book. How does it happen? You got the blank page. Do you plot it out beforehand or what?
I find that about half of novelists are outliners, and the other half, of which I'm one, are referred to as pantsters, because we write by the seat of our pants. They really should call us tightrope walkers, I think, because we walk that high wire with no net. But it's sort of the Stephen King school of Christian writing, and not that Stephen writes Christian stuff, but he says his approach is to try to put interesting characters in difficult situations and write to find out what happens. So in essence, I'm writing as a process of discovery. I have an idea where I'm going. Of course, with the Left Behind series, I knew that there were 21 judgments that come from heaven over a 7-year period, and I knew there was an important halfway point, and so there are landmarks along the way. But who these characters are and putting them in the way of these events and seeing what will happen was serendipitous, and I didn't know what would happen until I wrote it. And that kind of gives me an out when people say, why did you kill off my favorite character? And I can say, I didn't kill him off. I found him dead,
Wow. Well, when it first took off, were you just bewildered? I know you've had many best-selling books, but this is a whole brand new idea. Were you amazed with the way people responded to it?
I really was. The first year or so, I think it did around 80,000 copies in hardback, which, as you know, is a great sell. I mean, that's a tremendous success for any title. And then it just started to catch on as we were producing a couple of these a year. By the time we got, I think it was the 4th book, it was number 1 on Amazon a couple of weeks before it was released. As soon as people knew it was coming, they ordered it, and it was number 1. And then there was that pressure of each time knowing that all these millions of people wanted to know what was coming next. And usually when you're writing, it's solitary, and you just try to write the story, do the best you can with what's on the page. But I have to say, I did feel those eyes of all those readers looking over my shoulder and saying, get it done. We want to see more. So, but it just, at one point, I remember when the first 3 titles totaled about 1 million copies. I was feeling pretty good about myself and thinking, I've really pulled something off here, and I had no idea I was this great novelist. And then it started to multiply, and at the peak of its popularity, the books were debuting number 1 on the New York Times and then selling about 2 or 3 million copies within the first few weeks they came out. And the first book alone was averaging around 275,000 copies a month. And it had a strange impact on me. Rather than feeling so proud of myself, I felt overwhelmed, and I felt humbled by it. And it was like what folly it was to try to take credit for something that clearly is a work of God and is having an impact on millions of people around the world. And it sort of changed the way I looked at the work and at myself.
And when you would be would you send sample chapters through to Dr. LaHaye, or how would that work?
Yeah, I would send him 100 or 200 pages at a time, and besides keeping me on track theologically, I would ask him questions. I'd say, based on your view of Scripture, can I do this? Could this happen in the fictional scenario? Besides him responding that way, he was also such a great cheerleader. He would say, I love the story, and I want to find out what happens next, so send me more. And we've kept up to this day. I mean, here it's been, 15, it was almost 20 years coming up. The first one came out in 95. We actually met in the early 90s, so it's been 20 years since we've known each other, and still maintain a great relationship, and even lately talking about the possibility of trying something else, too.
Wow. So Left Behind is now left behind, as it were, but you may have a new one, eh?
I almost went 24 hours without a Left Behind joke. Now you made it.
The movies, it's probably difficult for you to critique them, but were you happy with them or not?
Well, we really weren't, and it was difficult because we didn't want to criticize in public, things that are having an impact on people. But Dr. LaHaye was so upset with the movies that he actually sued the producers. I didn't feel like we had the biblical right to sue people who claim to be brothers, and so I wasn't party to the suit, although I did have to testify and all that, and it was kind of a long, ugly, drawn-out thing. But I've been encouraged lately because I've heard that the people who own the rights have decided to try to do at least the first one better, and they're redoing it, and it's going to shoot later this year and appear in 2014. And it stars Nicolas Cage and a girl from Disney, and so I think by getting better actors and maybe a better script, it'll be a better movie. We just felt it had a kind of an amateurish feel about it.
Yeah.
And when the books had done so well, we hoped that it could really compete in Hollywood.
It's very interesting how this Christian film industry suddenly evolved, isn't it? And some of them are good and some of them are not so good. I remember as a kid, we had the Cross and the Switchblade, and it kept breaking down. The projector wasn't very good. The sound wasn't great, and but all of a sudden we've got this whole. Do you welcome this new crop of movies that are coming out?
Well, I really do, and I own a little film company myself, and my son is a director. We've done 4 feature films, and I think by getting the younger people involved, I'm not a filmmaker, and he is, and so I kind of defer to him, and they know how to use the technology, and this new generation, they don't just want to put out Christian films and have people say, wow, that's the best movie I've ever seen because it has a Bible verse in it or because it has a conversion scene in it. They want to compete technologically, and they want to compete from an acting standpoint, and so that the sound is good and the picture is right and the acting is right. And so, occasionally you'll see a Christian movie, and it's really well-intentioned and it's better than they've been. But when people say, wow, it's the best movie I've ever seen, you say, well, you haven't seen, some of the classics. I mean, we really need to be competing at the highest level, and I'm encouraged. I see a lot of young filmmakers coming along that are really going to do that.
That's wonderful. Now, you have also worked with Billy Graham on his memoirs, Just As I Am, and just before I ask you about that, I want to tell you a very funny story about that book. I believe he was starting to write the memoirs in Nice, was it south of France? And I was at I had the amazing opportunity to go to the funeral of Pat Nixon, where Mr. Graham did the service, and afterwards, I actually met Richard Nixon, had a brief chat with him, and then spoke to Mr. Graham, and I said, Mr. Graham, that was an incredibly moving sermon, and he said, I don't know. He said, everybody keeps dying. He said, I'm trying to write my memoirs, and I'm never going to get them finished. And it was so funny. But how were you involved then with the writing of Just As I Am?
Well, it was a great privilege. I remember being asked to first talk with his people, and then I think the president of the Billy Graham Association, and then to meet Mr. Graham himself, and I realized that there were several writers sort of auditioning for this, and I didn't really expect to get it. I mean, I heard a few of the names, and I thought they would be impressive guys to do that. And at one point, and I don't know how this happened. Usually, I'm better prepared than this, but at one point, the president of BGEA asked me what qualified me to write Mr. Graham's memoir, to assist him with his memoir. And rather than telling him how many books I'd written and how many biographies and how I was raised in this same tradition and that I'm a believer as he is, etc., I wasn't prepared for the question, and I just answered flat out honestly. I said, I'm not equipped to do that, and I'm not sure anybody is. I mean, this story is bigger than all of us, and it's you just need to do justice to the man and to his view of Scripture, and somehow they tell me later that everybody else was sort of selling themselves, and I was saying I'm not qualified, and they said that's the kind of guy we like.
Oh, that's wonderful. Well, I started in journalism working for Mr. Graham in London in '68, and then sadly got the left-footed fellowship, as they call it, but years later worked with him in Moscow and different places, and I always found him an absolutely charming and quite a funny guy. I don't know whether he meant to be funny, but he would say the most funny things in press conferences. How did you work with him, and what was your assessment?
Well, I worked with him over a period of about 12 or 13 months, and I would travel back and forth from my home in Chicago to visit him in North Carolina. And I found him the same behind closed doors as he is in public. Just riveting, devout, honest, and as you say, he is funny. I mean, I remember one time we were working. He wanted to get away from the office and everything, so we went to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and we're working in a hotel. We went down. He wanted to get a haircut, so we went into the barber shop in the hotel, and he was getting his haircut, and the manicurist struck up a conversation with him. She said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a preacher." And she said, "Oh, I don't care for too many preachers." She said, "The only preacher I really like is Billy Graham." And he said, "So you like Billy Graham, do you?" And she said, "Oh, yeah, he preaches straight from the Bible, and I really trust him." And he said, "Well, thank you, I am Billy Graham." And she said, "Oh, you don't even look like him." And so the barber backed up and pointed at him and mouthed to her, "It really is him."
Yes.
And she said, "Oh, my God." And Mr. Graham said, "No, but I work for him."
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah, I remember in talking to him about the the time they had rock music at Cleveland. And I don't know whether you mentioned this in the book, but I think he wasn't really madly happy with having DC Talk and Michael W. Smith on the platform, but it drew a huge crowd. And I said to him, well, what was it like, Mr. Graham? Saturday night, you're on the stage, 60,000 people in the audience, and what were your thoughts when Michael W. Smith and DC Talk were performing? He said, don't know. As soon as they came on, I switched my hearing aid off. And he never said, I'm sure it was great. He just said that, and I thought that's very typical of the man. He doesn't mean to be funny, but he's quite hilarious and a very humble man. How would you compare Billy Graham and D.L. Moody then?
Well, I have to think that they're very similar in their passion and, of course, their approach. I mean, every time you hear of Mr. Graham being anywhere, he shares the gospel. That was true with Moody as well. I think Moody was a little more bombastic and loud. Mr. Graham became quite a statesman and diplomat. I mean, one thing I found is that he seemed to be at ease almost in any situation. People who didn't understand him or his message might put him in the wrong situations or bring in people to meet him that he might be diametrically opposed to, and he would be so kind. One thing I noticed is he would be the same with a busboy or a waiter as he would be with a head of state. He would look him in the eye, he would listen to them, he'd talk to them. One time we were looking for a place to eat, and somebody was driving. Mr. Graham was sitting in the passenger side, I was in the back seat. We came up to a place he wanted to eat at, but there was a big, long line. And he said, well, let me just see if there's any openings. And he jumped out of the car and ran in to find out. And, of course, everybody recognized him, and they're pointing and making a big deal. And he just asked if there was any chance that we could get in. Of course, they made room for him.
Yes.
But he was just as kind and normal and didn't play the star or act like a big shot. He never did that.
That's great. Well, you've also worked on a whole bunch of As Told to autobiographies. One thing, I'd just be interested in your views on this. I wrote a book some years ago for someone, and then when the book came out, I noticed I'd written every word of it, but they took my name off it, or he took my name off it. And what are your thoughts on people doing the work, the writer, and then never getting a real credit on the cover or inside?
Yeah, I have come to encourage people to insist on that. And it's not for your ego; it's for your career and for credibility. I did ghostwrite 4 books, and they were all for well-known pastors, and it was all their material and their sermons, and I got all their notes, and I didn't feel bad about that, except that one kept referring in interviews to when he wrote this book, and of course he hadn't written it. But when I do the athletes and well-known people, actually with Mr. Graham, I didn't have my name on the book because I just assisted, but he mentions me in the acknowledgments. But on my books with professional athletes and that type of thing, my agent does insist that it say on the cover with or as told to.
Yes.
And my name can be in smaller type. It doesn't hurt anybody, and everybody knows that person is the subject. But they also realize that they're not writing. I mean, any more than I could hit a home run, Hank Aaron wouldn't write his own book. So
right.
I encourage young writers, insist on that somewhere, maybe on the title page inside. It needs to be clear because you need that for your career, and when you're going for other jobs, you can say, here's my book I did with so-and-so.
Yes. Well, have you ever figured out how many books you've sold so far?
It's right around 70 million.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, you're now at a writers' conference, I understand. Do you see a whole new generation of young writers coming up?
That's frankly a problem. I own the Christian Writers Guild, and what we're having this week, we have a residency for some of our top students. We have different courses. We have apprentice and journeyman and craftsman. And our craftsman fiction writers, there are 13 of them, they're in for a 5-day residency here in a hotel in Colorado. And we get some real concentrated training. But my guess is the youngest person in this group is going to be probably in their 40s. And at our annual conference, we have more, a wider range of ages. But that is the need. We're looking for young people because, I'm in my 60s. I know you're in your 70s. This crop of journalists and writers that have come through, we're on our way out. We have to face that, and we need to restock the pool. That's my goal with the Christian Writers Guild, is to restock the pool of Christian writers.
That's wonderful. Well, if someone's listening to this, Jerry, they'd like to know more about the Writing Institute or the work you do. Is there a website or websites?
Yeah, probably the best is, jerryjenkins.com for my stuff, but Christian Writers Guild, Guild, ChristianWritersGuild.com, tells all the things we have to offer, and we'd love to help writers.
That's wonderful. I'd like to encourage any young person to get involved with this. I started my career many years ago at a writers' conference. It's a wonderful way to meet people. But Jerry Jenkins, I want to thank you for a wonderful interview, and keep on writing as long as you can.
Thanks so much, Dan.